Welcome to CatalystWest Conversations, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is where we take CatalystWest, Western Sydney's largest ideas forum online, as is the way with these times. Over the next few weeks and months, we'll feature some speakers, some of whom you would have seen at CatalystWest, and some new ones. And we'll be talking about the response to these circumstances we're in, but also we'll be casting our minds further ahead to look at how things are changing in this emerging climate. I'm going to hand over to Helen Barcham, who will chair today's session. I'm Andy Marks, by the way, the Assistant Vice Chancellor, and Helen will introduce the other panellists. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Andy. Great to have the CatalystWest network back again. Yes, as Andy has mentioned just now, and over the emails that we've been sending out over the past few weeks, now more than ever really is this CatalystWest central theme of livability most pertinent. And so over the next hour, we will be exploring some of those and opportunities that we've been discussing for 2 years now with two panelists. So you just met Dr. Andy Marks there. He, of course, is the co-founder of CatalystWest and the Assistant Vice Chancellor. And of course, our other panelist is Professor Barney Glover, who many of you will know is Vice Chancellor and President at Western Sydney University. Welcome, Barney.
Hi, Helen. It's great to be here. In fact, it's particularly good to be part of CatalystWest, given I've only ever participated in CatalystWest in a virtual sense. I haven't actually physically attended one, so this is a very consistent format for me. It's nice to be able to chat in real time and not just in a video message, but no, it's great to be here with Andy and you, Helen, to have a conversation this afternoon.
Great. Well, over the next 30 minutes, Barney and Andy, I'll put some hard questions to you both, and then following that for 30 minutes, I'd like to open up a live Q&A. So I'm asking everyone that's playing along at home, please use the the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen to submit some questions that you'll have, and we'll do our absolute best to answer them. There's also a function at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand if you would like to, for us to actually get you on board and for you to submit your question via audio. Well, before we jump in, Barney and Andy, it seems most appropriate actually to check in on you both at a personal level. So how are you both holding up during social isolation? And I guess importantly, have either of you taken to bar or baking as a cathartic release?
Well, I'd be very interested in Andy's response to that, but look, it's very interesting to be predominantly working from home, something throughout my working life I've never had an opportunity to do. The nature of the job doesn't really permit a Vice Chancellor to work from home very often, but it's an interesting experience. It's back-to-back Zoom meetings through the course of a day, so it's intense. But there are elements I guess I'm enjoying about being at home with the family dog, and obviously my wife is upstairs working at the moment in her study. So I think there are some elements of it that that will persist, let's say. This is one of the, I'm sure we'll talk about it, it's one of the changes I think we're going to see in our working lives in various ways after COVID-19, and there will be a post-COVID-19 period.
Helen, I think one of the greatest innovations I'm bringing to this period is growing my beard. We all make little contributions in our own way. Look, all jokes aside, it's been one of the wonderful things has been the chance to spend a lot of time with my two kids and my wife, of course, I have to say that. But I typically see them at the bookends of the day, and I get to have that time with them all day. Of course, that comes with its ups and downs, but that's been amazing, and I'm treasuring that time because I know it won't last forever, thankfully. Yeah, it's been a real learning curve for everybody, but staying connected is the key.
I think though, Helen, before we hear your answer to your question, it is challenging though for many people. We notice this with the staff of the university at the moment who are working from home, and we've not only working from home for many of our academic staff, in relation to their research, but importantly now in relation to online learning and delivering our educational programs in a completely online format, something that they've done in a remarkably short time. But of course, it's in the context of social isolation, as you put it, and carer responsibilities, partners who may not be in work at the moment because of COVID-19, and obviously during school holidays, children studying from home. This is a complex set of circumstances that really is impacting on the lives of so many people. And I think we're thinking through, how do you provide the right support structures and that people are going to need? This is at the beginning of what might be, and I'm sure will be, several months of pretty challenging times for the people of Western Sydney. But what about you, Helen? How are you coping?
Oh, I'm coping relatively fine, I think. It was a bit of a transition to work from home because I am used to that quite a structured and routine of driving into work. But as many kind of Westies would understand, or I guess the thing that's great at the moment, if I can be so positive, is that a lot of us are foregoing that sardine commute, and as Andy's saying, reclaiming some time back to do those leisurely things, whether it's, you know, to watch Netflix or to bake a cake, and of course more time to spend with our loved ones, which is great. And I really hope that this will be a pivot point or a moment of cultural change, where this idea of reclaiming some a healthier work-life balance is something that will be enduring post-COVID-19.
I think elements of it will. We'll touch on this, I think, in a moment, but there are very significant elements of it that I think will persist. And importantly, I think employers are seeing how employees can operate in a way that they may not have ever imagined was possible. And that gives a greater flexibility in the discussions with colleagues about how we can actually do what we have to do on a daily basis, but we don't necessarily have to be in the workplace in the same way. And I think that will change. This is a change that will happen and will be a positive change once we get through this.
Yeah, on that note, Vice-Chancellor, I understand that over the last few months, your engagement with government, with business and community leaders has really significantly intensified. What are you hearing through those conversations, and what's your assessment of the way that COVID-19 is playing out in Western Sydney, not just at a health dimension, but more broadly?
Well, I think the first thing to say, Helen, is we need to thank our frontline healthcare workers right across Australia, right around the world. I mean, they're taking the brunt of caring for people. If we look at what's happening in Australia from a health perspective, just briefly, because as a university, of course, we have a medical program, thousands of nursing students. We'll be graduating the next health workforce for Western Sydney. So we're acutely conscious of what's happening in the health system. And we're fortunate in Australia at the moment that the steps the government has taken and the advice that's been applied across our communities in Australia is having an impact. There's no doubt about it on the figures we're all seeing, the infection rates, hospitalisation rates, and then of course the more challenging end when people are in ICU and on ventilators, and tragically the death rates are certainly much different here in Australia to what is being seen in Europe and the United States at the moment and in parts of Asia. So there's something we're doing right at the moment, and I'm confident it will persist, but our frontline healthcare workers are doing an extraordinary job. Our local health districts, and of course we in Western Sydney deal with the Southwest Sydney, Western Sydney and the P and Blue Mountains LHD, and then touch on the others, but what a remarkable job they're doing to ensure that we do have a world-class health system in Western Sydney, undergoing a lot of change. But I think it also reflects the resilience of our communities, not just here in Western Sydney, but we are resilient. We will come back from some of these challenges. I do, as you indicated a moment ago, Helen, I spend a lot of time in Zoom meetings with government officials, with business leaders, community leaders, and so on, as we talk about the response a university needs to make to this crisis and how we can support the government, and then how do we respond in the context of our own students and staff. I think from that perspective, we're still in that moment of high levels of anxiety about what's unfolding in the community. We're seeing some interesting, creative and innovative approaches to the challenges, but we can't, and I must congratulate the government as well for its package, both the state government and the federal government. Nothing is perfect, and there are parts of it that I'm sure we'll touch on that need to change, but governments recognise the importance of keeping the economy moving as best they can in the circumstances. But there is the creativity and the innovation out there, and we see it in Western Sydney, and that's to be applauded. People are finding ways to engage effectively economically, as well as maintain jobs and create new business models, and much of that will survive COVID-19, and I think put us in a much better position. You know, we'll talk a lot about resilience, we'll talk a lot about robustness. At the moment, we're all reflecting on fragility, and I think what we're seeing around the globe at the moment is a very fragile planet. And I'm sure sustainability in a whole range of ways will become much more in our mind as we go forward, not just responding to the challenges of climate change, but we need to be so careful about infectious diseases now and into the future. This is going to change the shape of the way we operate as a society. So I think Western Sydney is doing remarkably well. I congratulate everyone who's involved in keeping as much going as we can, and for people to be as supportive of these challenging restrictions we have in place as they are.
Thank you, Barney. And you mentioned there the high levels of anxiety that are playing out at the moment. And a key source of that, of course, is job security.
Yeah.
A question to you, actually, is you wrote an op-ed last year in July, and I'm going to quote you here. You said, "Job creation is the task that deserves the full and most urgent attention of our parliamentarians." Now, that, of course, was a different time. Lots has changed since then. And of course, what you were referring to at that time was the prevailing jobs deficit, which in Western Sydney, for example, equates to, I think, for every 84 jobs there are 100 people. So since then, as a way to address that jobs deficit, we've seen all three levels of government really come together through the city deal and commit 200,000 knowledge jobs by 2038. And my question to you is, you know, will these job targets be met with, of course, an imminent recession? And as we've seen recently, Treasury modelling indicating an unemployment rate that's going to peak to 10%. Is that viable?
I think absolutely, and we have to redouble our efforts because the urgency is all the more real now. I think for Western Sydney in particular, we've seen the largest disruption to the labour market and industry for a generation. And it was already a region that, despite its significant strengths, was having diverse pockets of disadvantage around employment and access to employment. So the real challenge now is to not just pursue job creation as a recovery exercise, but pursue it with an urgency that you could really only equate to a wartime time exercise. That means that, yes, the Western Sydney City Deal target for 200,000 jobs is necessary. Arguably, it needs to come online earlier. I think also we need to get very adept at responding to those distortions that have occurred in the labour market as a result of some industries and sectors suffering the impacts economically of this current situation. So that means that universities, TAFE, industry need to pull together in a direction that allows the rapid retraining and deployment of some people impacted into high demand roles. We've seen Minister Tehan signal that the Commonwealth's looking to reshape some structures to meet that need, but in Western Sydney, and we would say this, but I suggest that the urgency is even more paramount. The Vice-Chancellor may want to add to that, but I think we need to redouble our efforts.
Well, Andy, what I'd ask you though, I agree with you in principle. Absolutely, this jobs target is even more important now. It's much more challenging when we're going to see such widespread unemployment and underemployment. Let's not forget that we'll go through a period where people are underemployed in the economy, even more so than the sort of hidden unemployment we probably have now. The economy needs to lift to address that. What do you see of something like the Aerotropolis as being a driver for this? Is the government going to recognise, for example, that the Aerotropolis and perhaps other major centres in Sydney are going to have to be, as precincts, driven even harder, quicker, to actually get anywhere near that sort of job target?
I think it's a precinct-led recovery. I think that the Aerotropolis, by way of example, is a scenario where you have upwards of 20 large-scale international firms or foundational tenants signed on to establish alongside the new airport. Now's the time that we need to turn their attention towards recovery. I know that government via the Western Parkland City and the WACA are doing that. But we need to engage those international firms precisely at the moment when they'd be looking to retreat, understandably. And the Multiversity and the Aerotropolis is the perfect project around which to do that. I'm thinking of Liverpool, the Innovation Precinct, thinking also of Bankstown, the wonderful momentum we've seen at Westmead in recent years. All of those activations just become more desperately needed. And universities are central, along with health and along with industry, in that urban regeneration exercise that drives so much energy and industry attraction at precincts. So we've taken a hit and it's been a knockout blow. And whilst we're staggering around the ring, it's hard to recalibrate. But I'd suggest that precincts are the best way to land and focus the recovery. And ideally, that's the conversation that we'll have with Treasury and others who can add the stimulus. But I think that's the way we need to go.
Yeah, and to piggyback off what you're saying, Andy, it's been very curious to see the COVID-19 stimulus measures being delivered by the Morrison government to date. There's been no consideration for the role of infrastructure in that fiscal stimulus and in that way to revive the economy. So I guess a question for you, Vice Chancellor, is how important is infrastructure investment right now for Western Sydney? And in your opinion, what are the central and priority projects?
I think it's appropriate at the moment that the Commonwealth and the state government are focused on ensuring people are in jobs through this crisis, and that things like JobSeeker, JobKeeper programs are very, very important. I don't think JobKeeper went far enough. I think temporary visa holders and other vulnerable members of society, a lot of our casual workforce in the gig economy, as they say, are really not getting the support that they need. But it was a massive investment, 130 billion. I think it would have been another 25 billion to actually pick up those other parts of the economy. But that's an appropriate focusing, rental support and rental eviction moratoriums and so on. These are all critically important economic measures, extraordinarily significant in the context of Australia and the Australian economy. So they were important now. So you can understand that infrastructure is part of stimulus rather than maintenance of our economy through volatility. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment. But we will get to a very important conversation about the next wave. You've got to then pick up the economy and develop it. And infrastructure is the clear way to do that. We've been fortunate for the last 5 years in Western Sydney to see a whole range of projects, from the announcement of Badgerys Creek as the new airport through to a whole range of other rail and transport projects, light rail projects, the Powerhouse Museum moving to Parramatta and so on. These are crucially important federal and state supported pieces of infrastructure. What I would say is absolutely yes, infrastructure is going to be core to stimulus. Supporting Andy's comments a little while ago, precincts are going to feature strongly. We've got to get on top of those precincts with the best chance of job creation and job generation quickly. And our precincts lend themselves to that, particularly in Western Sydney. The onus is going to be on the government, both state and federal, to reaffirm the pipeline of projects that's currently under consideration, many of them getting close to shovel ready, if not already developing through the appropriate processes of Infrastructure New South Wales or Infrastructure Australia in the national context. So we need to ensure, and we need to hear from government, yes, those projects are going to go forward. Some of them may need to be fast-tracked, because there's no doubt that infrastructure investment by governments primes economies, gets people working, it gets activation, it starts to stimulate the breadth of the economy, not the narrowness of the construction industry, but the breadth of the economy. So it'll feature. So the first point is, let's get the reassurances on the pipeline, because there are a lot of important projects. Andy can talk about the North-South Rail link from St Mary's to the airport. We need to get that in the right corridor to ensure that we get maximum uplift and maximum job creation from that. Let's make that decision. Let's get the government to make that decision. Plus, I think there are a range of new projects, and we as a university are certainly out there promoting to parliamentarians, to government ministers and others, that there is a wave of other projects that are getting close to shovel ready. They need some support from our governments, but they are very, very close. They're very important, and they'll critically help us to drive that next wave of infrastructure investment and stimulus of the economy. But I'd go one step further beyond infrastructure as part of this economic stimulus. I think there's a really critical issue facing Australia in the rebuilding, the reshaping of our economy post-COVID-19. We shouldn't underestimate the shaking that we've had and how significant that rebuilding process will be. One of the challenges for universities, of course, is that at the moment we've seen a massive downturn in the international education markets. We're seeing fewer international students able to come and study in Australia. That will continue for the rest of this year. We won't see a lot of international travel to bring students in. That'll continue next year. Recovery will be slower. It's important to understand the interdependency between what is a $30 billion industry to Australia, international education, and the generation of revenue that supports universities to undertake research. This relationship between research and international education is a deep and intimate one. It has been for well over a decade. So if we're going through a period where we'll see less available resources from international education in universities, we are going to see research suffer. And this is not the moment in Australia where we want to see research suffer. The universities in the United Kingdom, facing exactly the same set of challenges, are advocating powerfully to the Johnson government to say we need a doubling of investment in research broadly. Partly, yes, in infectious disease research, in virology and microbiology and epidemiology, and all of those areas we need to ensure are robust and fit for purpose for the next pandemic. But increasingly, to rebuild our economy, we need the research in STEM and in the humanities and social sciences to support us. That's at risk at the moment in Australia, and we need to hear from government, how do we pump prime our research effort across the universities? That will grow the economy, because there's a direct relationship between research investment all over the world and increasing GDP, increasing jobs, increasing health and prosperity. So Helen, it's infrastructure investment crucial, but it's vitally important to remember that our research infrastructure, both real in terms of physical infrastructure and people, is also at risk here. And that's something I'd like to hear more from our governments about. I know that they are, at the moment, captured by the immediacy of the challenges, but you've got to think beyond that, and that's going to come up for, I think, a lot of attention over the course of the next few months.
Absolutely. Andy, did you have anything you'd like to add there?
No, I thoroughly agree.
But I think Andy's point about precincts is an important one, because I think in Western Sydney, we're well placed around Liverpool, the Liverpool Innovation Precinct. Andy mentioned Bankstown. Similarly with Campbelltown, opportunities there for development. Penrith in proximity to the Aerotropolis, Hawkesbury, Blacktown. We have great opportunities to take our health and education precincts and make them the job creation hubs of the next 5 years, because we can't afford to wait a decade. We need to actually be stimulating new jobs straight away. That 200,000 target is going to be hard to hit, but I think we can make a lot more progress if we really push our precincts hard.
I'd argue we have a great strategic backdrop with what the Commission delivered us. I think we need to bring all of those projects forward. The critical thing is to recognise the interdependencies. Judy Hendricks has put a question through, which is WSU taking on new enrolments from international students for the next years? And absolutely, I think would be the answer to that. I think our really rapid migration online is indicative of our capacity in that regard. So Absolutely.
Look, I think it's an important point. Of course, we are looking at recruitment, as every Australian university is. You can't take the second or third largest export industry in this country and allow it to be eroded without a response. And that response is, let's start to rebuild it. And there may very well be new models of delivering international education, as Andy's alluded to. But yes, we'll be recruiting international students to commence next year. Every university will. But I think universities are also stepping back a little bit and saying, well, what's the right shape of our outreach internationally in the context of what will be a slower recovery to international travel over the course of the next few years? So it's a good question. It's important to note that even in, say, Parramatta, and I congratulate Parramatta as the Parramatta City Council for what they're doing to create their new image, international image for Parramatta into the future. It's great. I think international education plays an important role in that, because we have a lot of international students in the Parramatta and Parramatta area, and they contribute hugely to the economy and to jobs in that central city, in that GPOP region. So they're vitally important to the future of Western Sydney.
Absolutely. And before we move into this direction, Vice Chancellor, I want to pick up on a point that you made a few minutes ago. You said there's an urgency for government to reaffirm the pipeline. And if I may be so bold, I'd like to actually turn that gaze or that conversation a little inwards. So Western Sydney University has publicly committed to a number of very large capital projects, including, of course, Liverpool Stage 2, a new presence in high-rise presence in Bankstown, and of course, which you and Andy have already alluded to, a multi-versity presence at the Aerotropolis. In light of the substantive loss that the university is experiencing, can you and will you remain committed to these projects?
Thanks, Helen. No, look, I think every university in Australia at the moment is grappling with some really challenging financial difficulties. That's true in society generally, and every business, every organisation, every agency is looking for ways to cut back, to preserve jobs, to work on our business case for the future, our business modelling for the future. All of that's underway. And one of the responses we've seen right across Australia is universities pulling back on their capital programs. And this is going to be quite a significant issue nationally over the next 18 months, in particular 2 years, because universities are really driving infrastructure development in almost every major city in Australia. So if they pull back, that does create an economic problem. We're doing the same. This year, we're pulling back on about $150 million worth of capital spending, which we're deferring out now into 21 and 22 as we begin to recover. But the projects you mentioned, Helen, are very important to us. And you mentioned the Liverpool Innovation Precinct and our next major building there with our partners at the Ingham Institute. Great work that they're doing. And I know they're doing some work on COVID-19 as well at the Ingham. The relationship we have with UNSW, of course, in that proposed expansion at Liverpool, that's a vitally important project. And I would be surprised if that is one of those projects that government steps in to move more quickly. Very close to being a shovel-ready project, vitally important to us. Bankstown, our campus in Bankstown will be the single biggest building that we build. It's essentially a $300 million development in the heart of Bankstown, critically important to the future of Bankstown and the LGA of Canterbury Bankstown, and vitally important to our future. So we are very committed to it, and we're not going to let the timeline slip on Bankstown, nor do we want it to slip on Liverpool. So we'll look for some support from the government to keep that moving rapidly. We're looking forward to the Macarthur Medical Research Facility that Lang Walker has so generously supported at Campbelltown. That's a major project to us. And what could be more important right now than medical research infrastructure in our hospital precincts? So that will be a priority. And although we've pulled back on some of our developments at Westmead, our next major research building there will go ahead. So we're very committed to that pipeline. The really interesting part of this, though, I think, is what's going to happen around the Aerotropolis and the multiversity. Can we secure an arrangement with the federal government and the state government to see that precinct and that initiative really drive ahead quickly post-COVID-19? That's going to be an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, and Paul's just submitted a question now on something similar. He says that noting the major changes in the commercial aviation sector, what's that going to mean? What are the implications for the Aerotropolis and the economic case for that? Can you address that, Vice-Chancellor? And perhaps you too, Andy, given that you lead the Aerotropolis project here at Western.
I might just
It's
jump
actually
in.
really interesting.
I think it actually broadens. I think it actually broadens the value proposition. So in many respects, what was a tightly focused approach around all of those industries and sectors linked to aviation now becomes a wonderfully broad and diverse set of industry attraction areas that we really didn't have prior to this. So it opens the palette up. It's a wonderfully fortuitous outcome of a really horrible situation.
But Andy, I think that the question really begs a response around the changes in the aviation industry. And I think you're going to see, in fact, I was reading an article today suggesting that the cost of international travel by air is going to be much more expensive as people slowly return to international travel after COVID-19, which means, and there's some airlines that won't survive. I mean, we're in Australia looking at massive bailouts for Virgin and obviously support for Qantas. What the aviation industry will look like post COVID-19. And if you go out only 5 years to when we want to see the first Qantas plane or Virgin plane or Rex land at Badgerys Creek at the new airport, it's going to be interesting to see what aviation industry looks like, what it looks like, and whether that impacts on the business case around Badgerys. I don't think there's any doubt on the importance of getting that infrastructure in place and with rail connectivity in a comprehensive way. But it's actually a very interesting point about the nature of the aviation industry. It'd be interesting, I think, to tease that out.
You might see a bigger shift towards freight and logistics away from passenger for at least the short term. But yeah, that's one to look at.
But I think it's something that possibly with the dialogue or with the business chamber, that question with some aviation experts might be worth exploring in one of these conversations, or possibly through one of the other virtual environments we'll be in over the next few months.
Absolutely. Let's talk politics now, Andy, given that you are our resident political scientist. So,
Right, isn't it?
moments of emergency, what we need more than ever is public confidence in government. And we know at the moment the Commonwealth Parliament is not sitting and won't be sitting until August. And this seems for many quite a destabilising decision to take, given that at the same time governments are introducing unprecedented power and control is being exercised. So my question is, how do we keep government accountable while at the same time maintaining public safety?
It's a really good question, Helen. And I'd just begin by acknowledging that the federal government, after a woefully inadequate response to the bushfire emergency, actually started on an incredibly strong footing in response to COVID. So whether that really terrible start over Christmas was a learning curve for them or not, they came out quite strongly. So credit where credit's due. The trick though now is to maintain credibility and the necessary response over the longer term. I think one of the really disturbing factors is that there won't be that level of scrutiny with Parliament sitting as often as it should. We know that there is the capacity to do that with reduced numbers. It's also troubling that there isn't opposition representation formally within that national cabinet. All of those things were possible during wartime under Curtin and under other wartime prime ministers and scenarios. Why are they not possible now? And in fact, I'd argue that they're essential. So that's the first point. The other one to remember is that we're seeing a very, very profound imposition on civil liberties. Essentially, we're operating under a quasi kind of curfew, which is necessary. And I think one of the strong rationales here is that government are doing this on the back of independent, objective health and related advice, which is in some respects exactly what you want to do. But without that level of scrutiny that Parliament provides and opposition representation provides, there isn't the checks and balances to ensure that we're not getting slippage. Another point I would add is it's incredibly, or not easy, but it's much easier to bring these types of restrictions in on public movement and access, and it's incredibly hard to unwind them though when they're no longer necessary. We know that's the case because many of the measures that have been brought in post the terrorism world, I think ones around detention and questioning and interrogation haven't been wound back. So that's what really we need to keep an eye on, just the imposition on civil liberties and that tension between what's necessary for public safety, but what's also a fundamental right as a citizen, and to crudely put it, as a taxpayer. I think it's there's big ticks for government in a lot of areas. So stimulus funding, particularly assisting those on welfare and those out of work, has been incredibly good. There are gaps, as Barney pointed to, that are important that need to be addressed. But the question will be, how do we manage that tension between civil liberties and public safety? And I would want the opposition at the table when you're doing that.
If I could add, Helen, I mean, I agree with Andy. This is always this balancing point about civil liberties, public safety, and scrutiny of the process of decision-making by government. I think the bipartisanship that's emerged through this crisis has been important, laudable, and I think sets a tone, I hope, for the way we may see our politics unfold in the future. The national cabinet concept that has operated with the Prime Minister and the Premiers, I think, represents across party lines a very real attempt to have scrutiny, but states have different priorities to the federal government in many ways, and different local interests they have to manage. So when it comes to our national parliament, I do think they need to find a way through the health concerns about meeting in Canberra and utilise technology to scrutinise legislation in an effective way. The parliamentary committee structure may be too cumbersome in an emergency situation, but time has to be set aside as quickly as it can be to scrutinise legislation and provide the public with that sense of reassurance. If you listen to the debates in Parliament that we had in the recent sitting, and I listened to some of them, I thought they were very thoughtful contributions. They were certainly questioning aspects of the JobKeeper package, and rightly so. I mean, as I said earlier, there are aspects of it which I think it falls short of what we needed, but I understand it's an incredible stimulus package for the economy. But nevertheless, I think those speeches reflected the fact that there were concerns that the government needed to hear. So we need to find a way to balance that. I think technology gives us an opportunity to do it. Hopefully that's something that will emerge in the not too distant future. So we're not waiting until August for a parliamentary sitting.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess just to pick up on that point there, Barney, about balancing, many social commentators are speculating what will happen actually as we pivot into the mitigation and recovery phase, and whether we will ever go back to business as usual. I guess, can you reflect on that, given the changes that we've seen here at Western Sydney University, the fact that many of us, almost all of us, are working from home, the shift to online education? Will we ever go back to what we had before?
No, I don't think we will. And in a number of ways, that's a good thing. I think there are aspects of the way institutions like universities have evolved over the last 20 years, when we're on the cusp of the way technology can profoundly change access and participation in higher education. Even though we've had online education and high quality online education for a long time, that hasn't been as prominent, if you like, in some of our big research intensive universities. And now they're all delivering online and finding, in fact, that this is an opportunity to enhance their reach and provide new ways for people to participate in higher education. The government at the weekend announced their university support package, and one aspect of that was a new higher education certificate that universities could offer a relatively low cost, certainly from a student perspective, certificate, so it would help them to reach people who are displaced at the moment economically because of COVID, but to retrain for new industries, so the IT industry, absolutely one of the growth industries of the next decades and beyond, and the health industry. No doubt that healthcare and personal care, disability care, aged care, these are incredibly important parts of society that will grow in need well into the future. So having people retrain is vitally important. We've now built up some capacity to actually move more freely into those spaces. That might have been the case if we didn't have this terrible COVID-19 crisis. Now, things won't be the same again. That doesn't mean to say we'll suddenly become online only, because our campus experiences for many students are so critical. But this has awakened, I think, an opportunity in our sector. But it's also true in many others. People have been very creative about the way their businesses are changing. I know there was a KPMG report today I was reading that was talking about the number of steps that businesses are going to need to take to ensure that what they learn from this experience can be applied to new business models for the future, and to make sure that business can be robust and flexible and resilient in the face of whatever circumstance beset them. I think there's a number of other societal changes that we're seeing which are going to be really interesting to watch them play out. One of the most important, I think, post-COVID activities we need to engage in is to look back and understand what happened from a social science perspective as much as a infectious disease or epidemiological perspective or public health perspective. There's a huge amount of data that's being generated from this crisis. We need to have experts in universities, particularly from the social sciences and the humanities, look at what's happened to understand how society is going to change. So I think there are some profound things for us out of this crisis, and I think in many cases for the better, but time, I guess, is going to judge that. Do you agree, Andy, or do you think it's...
No, I do agree. I think that one of the really important considerations, and you mentioned this the other day, was that we're in only what would be considered the early phases of this. There's going to be a fatigue that sets in socially, and there'll be some behavioural dynamics that come into play in the way that we interact over coming weeks, because lockdown won't end anytime soon, even though we are achieving encouraging results around spread. So I think what happens in terms of the psychology of coping through this mitigation phase will be a point that governments and industry, universities need to turn their attention to. And I'm pleased that we're doing that. But the importance of staying connected, the importance of keeping your mental health up and staying engaged will only grow in coming weeks, because it's a novelty when we begin. It's stressful, absolutely, but the novelty wears off over time, and it's what's going to happen in those coming months that'll be the real test.
There's an interesting question in the Q&A at the moment that's worth touching on at this point, I think, Helen, from Jane, talking about the short course initiative that the government announced, which is an online intensive 6-month short course for reskilling. But it quite appropriately raises the question of, well, how are sectors like the vocational training sector, TAFE, and universities, which in many ways are embedded in a particular paradigm of the way in which we go about higher education and further education, how are we going to adapt rapidly into the future? I think is a very good point. Yeah. On the positive side, I think there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years, in fact, about the relationship between vocational training and higher education. And I know one of the aspects that Andy might pick up on when we look at what's going on with the Aerotropolis is that importance of vocational training, skills development, working hand in hand with higher education and the interface with research. Having these sectors work together in new models for delivering education a lot more flexibly, a lot more entry points and exit points, utilising micro-credentialing more so that industry can become, reassured, in fact, that the graduates that are coming out at various stages from study in this new post-secondary sector have the right skills at the right time to be job ready in what will be a high-tech, knowledge-based set of industries. That's going to be crucial. We need to develop those models. We've been working on them. I think what's happened in the last few weeks has begun to bring home just how important it is to move quickly and further on that collaboration between TAFE higher ed than we've ever seen before. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, it's been a real circuit breaker. One of the really encouraging things about discussions with the WACA and government more broadly is that what seemed impossible only weeks ago with regard to TAFE university collaboration and collaboration more broadly with industry is now suddenly more than possible. It's actually happening. The TN initiative is more about the signal it sends, about the willingness to engage in structural reform as well. That's a very important signal from the Minister. The real brass tacks will come down to what we do in particular sites. And you have a wonderful opportunity in the Aerotropolis in the Western Parkland city because it's a distinct jurisdiction. You can try all of the dynamic stuff that you need to really push collaboration. Rapidity will be important as well. And that first tranche of retraining that we can deliver with TAFE will be a real test of our mettle.
Andy, one other element that you just touched on, I think is also worth reflecting on, and Helen might have been intending to raise this, but I think there is a moment now for us to look at models of collaboration between universities as much as with our partners in TAFE. And I know we have, very strong relationships with TAFE New South Wales and the new leadership of TAFE New South Wales, and I think that we'll see an opportunity there for innovation and creativity. But I also think that as a university, we have been very focused in our region on working with the universities that want to work with us. Great relationships with UNSW in Parramatta and emerging in Liverpool and Campbelltown. The relationship we announced late last year with UTS in Bankstown when the new campus is built there. The discussions we've been having with the University of Canberra around our Olympic Park and sports science, sports development opportunity there. The work we did that you were pivotal to with Helen around GPOP and the relationship with the University of Sydney. Great opportunities here. And of course, with the partners in the new alliance around the multiversity, we are going to see new models of collaboration between universities that are going to be vitally important because we've got to recover from what is a shock to the higher education system.
Yep.
And those collaborations are going to be deeper than people might imagine. And we might see some significant structural reform in the Australian university sector. I think one of the signals from Minister Tehan at the weekend was the importance of the private higher education providers, the non-university higher education providers, new HEPs as we call them, and the role they will play in delivering higher education in the future. So the very clear signal, I think, from the government on that. Look at similar trends in the UK. I think we're in for an interesting reform agenda over the next 18 months in higher education.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, and Barney, are you able to say more about these new models of collaboration, not just within university to university, but perhaps university to community? Of course, one of the key themes that emerged at CatalystWest is this idea that nobody gets left behind. And we're unfortunately seeing some of that play out in really heartbreaking ways. Just this morning, I went to get a takeaway coffee and in Western Sydney, and there was a gentleman that came to buy his coffee but only had cash. And they said to him, oh, we're not accepting cash at this moment, card only. And he obviously was not in a state to be able to afford to pay for his coffee by a card, and proceeded to walk away. And I think that's just a micro example of both the small pockets, but also we know that these are playing out in larger structural ways of disadvantage. So the question to you and to you also, Andy, is what role is a university taking in redressing or perhaps attending to some of the disadvantage that's playing out in Western Sydney?
Helen, education is a vital part of addressing and redressing disadvantage in the community. So one of the great things about Western Sydney University is that we are here with a mission to support our region, to advocate and to champion the region and the people of the region, in a very heterogeneous region, as you've touched on, with pockets of real disadvantage. And that we need to be there as the university to provide pathways to higher education, to make sure that our research is targeted at community resilience. I think this is one of the other things we'll see post-COVID-19. We will be reflecting on on the very significant range of research that we undertake in our community, which is globally significant without a doubt, but is very regionally focused. You'll see sustainability in every aspect of the word and the concept of sustainability becoming of paramount importance to the university, in our communities, with our partners, and in the way in which we provide pathways to higher education. To see people have an opportunity to come out of a crisis with greater hope for a career, for greater job readiness, to be able to engage in the economy more effectively, and to begin to see the benefits of the infrastructure investment as one aspect of it in lifting the health and well-being of our communities, not just the well-being from an economic perspective, but the health of our communities and the mental health of our communities. So university plays a vital role. Right now, of course, we're converting to online, but a lot of our colleagues are looking at ways in which we can be even more supportive to schools in Western Sydney, disadvantaged schools to some extent. How can we provide more support to the online learning that teachers are having to do in our region, so that those young school students in Western Sydney have just as rich an educational experience online as those who might be in more affluent parts of Sydney. So the community reach from the university will be even deeper post-COVID. And I think as I said, our research will go deeper into the community, and to come out of that with ideas for policy development, new initiatives, and ways the university can support the growth of our region, which is on a great trajectory, notwithstanding this shudder that we're experiencing at the moment. Andy, have you got any thoughts on that role, university community role?
Yeah, completely agree. It's the reason why I do the job. I know that's the case for you too, Helen and Barney. The transformative power of education, it's completely unmatched in the way that it can, I think, transform generations. Western Sydney and the mission that we have here, in some respects it's the hardest, but it's the easiest thing to do, because you recognise just what wonderful potential we have here. One of the things that we're doing through this time is increasing our support for our partners like Western Sydney Community Forum, and staying engaged with those people that deal with such challenging situations, for people that may not have digital access, for people that are really struggling profoundly during this time. I know that the Student Hardship Fund that the Vice-Chancellor's championed and the Senior Executive is supporting, a whole range of initiatives are really coming into play when they're needed most. And we said that the university would stick by this region through thick and thin, and now we're needed more than ever. And I'm just so proud to be part of an organisation that steps up to the plate, really proud.
And certainly, just to emphasise that, it's one of the most impressive things I've seen in recent weeks amongst many in the community. I mentioned frontline health workers, but the way our staff have reached out to support each other and to make this transformation so rapidly, bearing in mind how important it is for people to have access to high quality, world-class higher education right now. This is not the time for our universities to go offline. They need to be online, they need to be engaged, and we need to provide that education. It's challenging, but if we want to see the momentum that's building in Western Sydney continue, and to see some of those issues you touched on, Helen, addressed, the university is going to play an important part in it.
I hope you bought the guy a coffee, Helen.
I didn't have to, Andy. I came to, but someone turned around and actually did that, which was, again, one of those micro ways that we're seeing, you know, notions of community actually playing out, which is really heartwarming. Look, I'm mindful that we've got about 5 minutes left. So if you're at home, you're watching, you're listening, and you've got any burning questions, please submit them now via the Q&A function. You can also tweet us at #CatWest, and we will endeavour to include you or to address those questions in the next instalment of CatalystWest Conversations. We did have a question from Dr. Olivieri, who of course was a fantastic panellist at the November forum on the role of arts and culture at the moment. We know that the creative industries and the sector is one of many that have taken that have been significantly impacted at the moment. Andy, I should really put this question to you, given that way before you joined Western Sydney Uni, or I should actually say way before you joined Western Sydney University. You were, of course, a musician yourself. What was the name of your band, The Crows, or?
Yeah, something like that, Helen. It's not important, really.
You can Google it,
no.
Helen. You can Google it. It's
Great.
It's well known. I know nothing about music, but Andy's assured me of how successful he was, particularly if anyone out there has an opportunity to ask him about his world tour. He's done world tours and has had interesting experiences in the music industry. Andy, arts and culture.
Look,
getting a fix, Andy, at the moment with so many of our amazing museums and galleries and pubs and clubs closed at the moment.
it's called the creative sector for a reason. And I think what I'm just so impressed by is the versatility and innovation that we've seen amongst musicians and artists more broadly in pushing content online. The onus is on us, though, to respect the fact that these guys don't do this for free, and nor should they. I know the university is a strong supporter of groups like Urban Theatre Projects, of which Jess, of course, is a wonderful advocate. But it's critical now that when we see gigs online and when we see installations and creative events migrating online, that we support them, and where possible, we do so financially. I think they're one of the biggest and most original exponents of the gig economy. They were doing it long before it became fashionable, and they live literally from gig to gig. I remember that as a musician. One of the most memorable parts of that was that I lived a cosmopolitan life, but was incredibly poor. Somehow you scrape through, but now's the time when they need us. And I've watched a few gigs over the recent weeks. We've exchanged songwriting online with some colleagues I haven't seen in years. So people are coming out of the woodwork, but it's up to us to get behind them and back them, because we only get through this kind of scenario with creative thinking. And we must ensure the artists are also at the table when we redesign the kind of environment that we want to come into in recovery. So yeah, don't forget about them and stick with them.
And look, can I just reinforce how important that is? We've made progress, absolutely, with arts and culture in Western Sydney in recent years. It is vibrant. It needs more support, without a doubt. Coming out of this, people will want to get out of the isolation and engage again in all of the cultural activities that we find so precious and are so important to us. As an element of that, I'm very pleased to be the President of the Board of Trustees of the Powerhouse Museum, and the move to Parramatta, the fabulous design for the new museum, one of those projects that I'm sure is going to go ahead rapidly in the post-COVID environment, but also the Museum Discovery Centre at Castle Hill, another fabulous initiative of the state government that is going to expand. We're going to have some great new cultural assets, cultural infrastructure in the West in the next few years. So a lot to look forward to, but I agree with Andy. We have to help the arts and culture community to work through this, and we're very committed to our Western Sydney Creative, our strategic decadal plan to support the arts in Western Sydney. And a little hiccup this year as we work through COVID, but we'll certainly be supporting that in the future. Helen, I noticed a quick question from Bernard about engaging with industry in times of stress. One of the great things I know you're working on, Andy and Helen, and others are, CEDA is, and the Business Chamber and others, moving into some really exciting online virtual conversations like this with panelists of people who are willing to give up some of their time to start driving a discussion about how we're going to interact and create the new future. I think that's where we're going to be able to find mechanisms to connect with industry and business in the next few weeks and months, and then to go beyond. So I do think the virtual environment provides us with one of those real opportunities. So just worth noting that question from Bernard.
Thank you, Barney. And you've wrapped up just exactly on 4 p.m. So what I might do is just wrap up now, because we did promise at the sharp end. I just want to reiterate to everyone that these are ongoing conversations. It's a dialogue. The work doesn't end here. This is, of course, the first instalment of CatalystWest Conversations. It's our commitment to the community, and we will be delivering these regularly. If you have any comments, or you want to nominate yourself or somebody else in the community as a panelist, or if you think that we didn't address with enough nuance or specificity a certain topic or issue, please write to us. You can write to Andy and I at catalystwest@westernsydney.edu.au. And yeah, well,
Helen, can I just add, please stop sending requests to see in Western Sydney tonight, okay? We are absolutely deluged with them and we just can't find the tapes.
No, Andy, they were taped, I don't know how long ago. They were a long, long time ago, but it's lovely to see them being aired again. And I'm looking forward to continuing to participate in Western Sydney tonight. It's a great initiative. Well done.
We are still trying to get Paul Wellings on if we
Paul
can.
Wellings, we're looking for Paul. I haven't found him, but I know he's about.
Sorry, Helen.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Barney Glover, Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University, and to Dr. Andy Marks. See you all.
Bye. Thanks, Helen.
Bye.